Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the Abington Town Hall and the Abington Town Meeting. We will be discussing the state budget. My name is John Kennan. I'm the state senator. I represent Quincy, Braintree, Abington, Rockland, and Holbrook. And before we get underway with the presentation, I would like to introduce Representative Rhonda Nyman, who represents Rockland, Hanover, and Norwell. She's here with us tonight. And Rhonda, if you'd like to say a few words, Representative. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kennan, and for hosting tonight's PowerPoint presentation. I'm Representative Rhonda Nyman. I represent the towns of Rockland, Hanover, and Norwell. And I serve on the House Ways and Means Committee, and I just wanted to make a few comments about the budget tonight. And I've heard a lot of testimony as I have traveled across the Commonwealth regarding the revenues, the needs for the new revenues that are coming in across the Commonwealth. And I just want to let you know the House budget, there really hasn't been a lot of conversation yet. We will get our House budget. That'll be released April 10th. So at that time, we'll have a lot of conversation and more debate at that time. And hopefully we'll be filing some amendments to that too as well. I do know that the Speaker of the House has not embraced not many of the governor's recommendations in regards to the governor's proposal. So I know he hasn't embraced too much with that. But also, I just want to mention too, as far as the transportation, hopefully that's going to be addressed prior to the budget. And I know we need to work on that. And again, nothing has been addressed to us at this point, but that's something that we're going to look forward to, and hopefully sooner than later on that. But I just want to let you know, if anybody has any questions or concerns in regards to any of the tax increases or any revenues or anything like that, please don't hesitate to reach out to my office. I apologize, I cannot stay for the rest of the presentation. I do have another commitment tonight, but certainly don't hesitate to reach out to us if there's anything or questions or concerns that you have. I've left some business cards over here for you, and look forward to hearing from you. But thank you very much, John. Thanks again for inviting me here tonight, and good luck.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Representative Nyman has been pretty much all over the state hearing the testimony. What happens as far as the process goes is the Ways and Means Committee in joint fashion goes out to different areas of the Commonwealth and takes testimony from not only the various department heads, commissioners, and as members of the governor's administration, but also from the public. And they get all that information, they use it as groundwork basically for preparing the House budget and the Senate budget. And we'll go over the process for the budget process near the end of the presentation. So thank you again, Representative Nyman. What we'll do this evening is basically just work our way through the PowerPoint presentation. There's a lot of material here. I will go through it relatively quickly, then we can take any questions that may arise. And we give the information that's in the PowerPoint in written form for people so that they have that information available. And you'll notice as you go through the PowerPoint that a lot of the information comes from various sources. And the sources that are at the bottom of the slide are online sources, and they've got a wealth of information. For instance, massbudget.org is a great website that has a whole lot of information. The Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation has a great website, and the state website itself, and particularly the governor's portion of it, has a lot of information that backs up what he's preparing to do. Well, a while ago, the governor filed what they call House 1. That's the governor's version of the state budget. It's his recommended budget. It is accepted in the House of Representatives. It's given a number, and then it's assigned to the Ways and Means Committee. The House Ways and Means will be working on theirs, but what happens when the governor introduces his budget, it usually initiates a lot of conversation, and that's what's happened with his budget this year. His budget really is one that calls for new revenue and calls for additional spending, and we'll go over that. So first slide here, what I thought would do is give you a little bit of context relative to the Massachusetts economy, because I think it's good to get that as a framework. The Massachusetts economy is doing pretty well. As a whole, it continues to outperform the national economy. There's about 1% growth in fourth quarter 2012 here in Massachusetts compared to a negative growth rate for the balance of the country, negative growth of about 0.1%. So while the rest of the country remains relatively stagnant, the Commonwealth has seen a 1% growth in its economy, particularly in the fourth quarter of 2012. Unemployment in January 2013 here in the Commonwealth was at 6.7%. and it was 7.9% nationally. The February numbers have just come out, and the Massachusetts unemployment rate now stands at 6.5%. And I have not seen the U.S. rate for the month of February, but again, the Massachusetts rate is down to 6.5%. The state gross domestic product here in Massachusetts grew at a rate of about 1%, which exceeded the national rate, which was, again, just slightly below 1% in the fourth quarter of 2012. So things are going pretty well here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Not as well as everybody would like to see them go, but nonetheless, there is a movement forward. Going forward, there's an expected modest growth in the residential real estate market. The overall Massachusetts economy is predicted to grow approximately 3% in the first half of 2013. We don't have any 3-month numbers, for instance, or 2.5-month numbers on that, but there is an expectation that it will grow somewhere about 3%. Some of the predictions range from 2% to as high as 3% for that first half of 2013. And the 3% number comes from a group that is out of the UMass Donahue Institute, and it is in partnership with the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. So it is a nonpartisan, highly respected organization that does look at those growth numbers. The next slide talks about economic concerns. In general, there is a lot of uncertainty out there still, and the uncertainty is tied to the impact, the expected impact of the federal sequester cuts. Massachusetts technology sector, which is a significant sector here in the Commonwealth, could be impacted by cuts to the defense budget. And the education and healthcare sectors, again, which are very significant here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, could be impacted by the sequester cuts in the Defense Department, in the NIH budget, and in the National Science Foundation. What does it mean more specifically? It means that about 20,000 students here in the Commonwealth, in other areas of these cuts, as a result of other areas of these cuts, about 20,000 students would lose access to supports and special education. About 1,100 children may lose access to Head Start. About 7,000 Department of Defense employees would experience furloughs. And I don't know if anybody saw the news today, but there was a protest up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where federal employees up there facing the first of their furloughs. They're expected to go on furlough, I think, 21 or 22 days over the course of the next several months. So they will be losing approximately 10% in their earnings. And that has a significant impact on the economy because that decreases the buying power of the local population. So it's scheduled to happen up in New Hampshire. It will be happening here in Massachusetts as well. There will be cuts in funding for senior meals. Approximately 2,940 fewer children will receive vaccinations for all kinds of things, including whooping cough and things of that nature. And there's about 26,970 people who are expected to lose access to job training as a result of these sequester cuts. So that gives you a general sense of where we are with the economy and what the impacts of what's going on at the federal level may be. So what I thought I'd talk about next is the state budget. And I think it's important to get some sort of historical context on the state budget. If I could just take a quick break here. Slide presentation. Just wanted to get this. And I apologize for those who are viewing at home. The people here in the audience do have the written materials. Some of these numbers are pretty small, but what this slide here shows, and this is the 6th slide, shows the Massachusetts state budget, and we've labeled it the past because it gives you a snapshot of what has happened to the budget in some key areas since fiscal year 2012. So it shows fiscal year 2012 to fiscal year 2013, which is our current fiscal year, which will end on June 30th. If you notice in the bottom of the fiscal 2005 column, the total budget at that point was about $26.7 billion. The fiscal year 2013 budget's at about 35.3. So there has been an increase in the budget. But when you look at some of the details that are presented on the page, it gets rather interesting. For instance, you can see that education spending peaked in about fiscal year 2009 at about $6.8 million, and here we are 4 fiscal years later, and it's about $6.9 million. So there's been very little additional spending in education. When you look at the environment and recreation, you can see that there was a peak number of about $234 million in fiscal year 2006, and that is down to $175 million for fiscal year 2013. There's several cuts in other areas. Human Services was at basically $3.4+ million back in fiscal year 2009. It is essentially level in fiscal year 2013. And these are in real dollars, not adjusted yet for inflation. Local aid, you can see, peaked at about $1.345 million back in fiscal year 2008, and it's down to $936 million in fiscal year 2013. So when you look at those cuts or level funded items, it makes you pause and inquire, why then has the overall bottom line gone up? Well, one of the main reasons this has gone up is that healthcare costs have grown rather exorbitantly, and you'll notice that back in fiscal year 2005 it was about $10 million. In fiscal year 2013 it's about $15 million. So that cost, that budget item has increased rather significantly, while most others have remained pretty level or in fact have experienced cuts. So that's it in real dollars. The next one just shows you a graph of that. It shows again fiscal year 2005 at that $25+ million figure. Fiscal year 2013 up about that $35 billion figure, I'm sorry. And it shows you the increase, and you can see there's a leveling off over the last couple of years. The next slide is basically the same information, but it's adjusted for inflation. And the adjustment here is on an index that's used to measure the increase in cost on goods and services that the state government typically buys. And you will see in inflation-adjusted dollars that spending has remained relatively flat. In fiscal year 2005, adjusted for inflation, the state was spending about $35.9 billion. Fiscal year 13, which is our current year, we're about $36 billion. So really a pretty negligible increase in the state budget when you adjust it for inflation, particularly using that index that's used for government services and goods. And you can see where some of the cuts have occurred in some of the budgets, and some of them have been rather significant. So the state has found itself in a position, particularly since fiscal year 2008, of having to cut back in most areas to afford the increases in health care and in a couple of other budget items. But that's the primary one that has gone up over these past few years. The next slide shows that what we just went over. It shows you more graphically that there have not been any major increases in spending when adjusted for inflation. The next slide will just highlight what I had mentioned earlier about health care as it compares to the overall spending. The first one is, again, not adjusted for inflation. You can see the increase in the state budget, and you can see a rather steady increase in the health care costs as well. When you look at that for the inflation-adjusted numbers, you can see that overall spending is relatively level, and you can see that increase scaled, but you can see that increase nonetheless on health insurance spending. And health insurance spending, I'm sorry, not health insurance spending, but health spending within the state budget covers a whole host of things. It covers health insurance for state employees. It covers mass health and a whole host of other programs that are included in the budget. And then this next slide shows you health care as a percentage of the overall budget, and you can see how it troughed a little bit FY06, FY07. Then there was an increase through FY 2011. It leveled off a little bit there, and those that have looked at that, who have studied it, have come to the conclusion that as the legislature was looking at doing payment reform, which I can touch on a little bit later, but the legislature passed a healthcare payment reform legislation. As that was being worked on, as that was being researched, as that was being developed, the industry kind of froze in anticipation of that. There was a lot of uncertainty as to which direction the state would go in, and so a lot of the healthcare industry pretty much froze in anticipation of that legislation. That legislation did pass, and again, we can touch on that a little bit later. The other thing that I wanted to just look at quickly was taxes. When the governor put his proposal out there, it called for a rather dramatic increase in taxes. And we received a lot of contact from people, whether by email or by telephone, saying, you know, my taxes keep going up, please stop raising taxes. So I thought it would be important to get a good look at what we've done here in Massachusetts relative to taxes at the state level, and then also with a little bit of a tie-in to state and local combined. So the next slide basically details some tax reductions. A lot of people don't know this, but the state income tax, personal income tax rate here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts has been reduced from 5.95% to 5.25% over the past several years. And most recently, it went down just this past year. It doesn't receive a lot of press. There's a formula that's involved, and it occurs automatically. A vote is not required, but it went from 5.3 something, might have been 5.32, I'm not sure of the number exactly, but it went down to 5.25%. Also, personal exemptions have been doubled from $2,200 to $4,400 per individual. Tax on dividend income has been reduced from 12% to 5.3%. And the above accounts, which I'll show on the next slide, the above accounts for approximately $3 billion in reduced revenue on an annual basis. What that means is, as a result of these tax decreases over the years, when properly adjusted, it results in an annual basis, present-day dollars, of about $3 billion less than what we had been receiving in tax income a few years ago. And this slide here shows it for fiscal year 98 through 2002, and it then brings it forward into 2013 dollars. It shows that about $1.55 billion was given back to the taxpayers by way of a tax cut on the personal income rate, and about $870 million on the dividend and interest rate cut, and then about $550 million in those other things such as a doubling of exemption and so forth. So about $3 billion, it's what's been given back to taxpayers. If that money, if those rates had stayed the same, if those exemptions had stayed the same, the state right now would have about $3 billion in additional revenue. But that occurred over the course of several years. This next slide shows you what your annual state taxes as a share of personal income are. What that means is basically for the average individual, what portion of their income are they paying as state taxes. You can see going back to 1988 that from that point to 1998, they were paying about 6.3% of their personal income to state and capital gains taxes. It then began to decline in about 2003, 2004, and the average between 2003 and 2012 ends up being about 5.3%. So there's been a pretty substantial drop in personal income and tax rates as a share of personal income. Annual taxes paid as a percentage of personal income. Again, about $3.8 billion since 1998, and it shows an average of 6.3 down to 5.3%. So how do we compare to other states? You'll see that in fiscal year 1977, Massachusetts was a relatively high tax rate. We were known as Taxachusetts. And taxes as a share of income were higher in Massachusetts than all other states except Alaska and New York. So the tax burden on the individual taxpayer here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was the third highest in the country back in 1977. Numbers for 2010 show that as a result of the reductions of taxes, there's been a pretty dramatic shift. Between 1977 and 2010, Massachusetts has reduced taxes more than all but one other state, and that other state was Arizona. So you can see that state and local taxes as a percent of state personal income tax in 2010 is below the national average. The national average, when you combine your state income tax and your local property tax, is at about 10.6%. Here in Massachusetts, it's now at about 10.2%. So it's been a pretty dramatic shift. So what has that meant as far as what's happened at the state level? Well, a few things. One, you had that decrease in revenue as a result of changes in the tax rates, and then also you had the economy, the floor in the economy basically fall out back in 2008, which resulted in additional losses of revenue. So you can see that between fiscal year 2001 and fiscal year 2012, overall, there's been about a 28% cut in early education. And again, these are some of these numbers are adjusted for inflation. Environment and recreation spending is down 38%. Higher education is down 31%. Infrastructure and economic development is down 17%. Kindergarten through 12, Chapter 70 funding is down 8%. Local aid, which cities and towns like Abington, Rockland, Holbrook, depend upon for police, fire, and schools, and a whole host of other things, including libraries. Local aid is down about 46%, and spending on public health is down about 25%. So the combination of a change in tax rates, the tax structure, and also the economy really tanking in 2008 have led to some pretty dramatic cuts in the state budget. So that's kind of where we're at right now. 2013 was considered basically a maintenance budget. It basically maintained the spending that the Commonwealth had been doing. It did not have a whole lot of new revenues. It did not have a whole lot of new spending. It did succeed in eliminating some of the structural deficit that existed in the state budget. And when there's a structural deficit, what that means is there's not continuing revenue available to fund what you're paying for. So you take one-time revenue to try to support it, and the next year you have to find another source of one-time revenue. So you have a structural deficit. The state has done a pretty good job over the last couple of years of reducing that structural deficit. So it brings us to today, and what's before the legislature today is the governor's budget, H1. He has laid that budget out with a couple of top priorities. Education and transportation will receive significant new funding if the governor's proposal is adopted. Healthcare, public health, and local aid will receive additional funding if his proposal is adopted. So the question becomes, how does the Commonwealth overall pay for what is about $3 billion in more spending? And the governor's proposal calls for an increase in the income tax rate from 5.25% to 6.25%, a decrease in the sales tax from 6.25% to 4.5%, and then about $550 million in one-time revenue, including about a $400 million draw from the rainy day fund. Massachusetts has a stabilization fund or a rainy day fund that has a balance presently of about $1 billion. It is, if not the highest in the country, then basically per capita, it is one of the highest. So the Commonwealth has done a pretty good job of putting money away. It had, prior to 2008 as well, it had over $3 billion, and that allowed the Commonwealth to keep some of the programs in place during those difficult financial times. So that's really what the governor's proposal is in very broad terms. This slide, which I apologize to people watching at home, has some pretty small numbers on it. I will just give you a sense. In education, the governor's budget calls for an increase of about $612 million. In environment and recreation, an increase of about $19 million. In health care, calling for an increase of about $929 million, almost $1 billion. Human services, an increase of about $155 million. Infrastructure, housing, and economic development, about $319 million increase over the present fiscal year. Law and public safety, about $120 million increase over this year's budget. Local aid goes up about $30 million over the current year. And so the total increase is about $2.3 billion in spending in very basic numbers. So now, to fund that, as I mentioned earlier, he calls for new revenue, and he calls for it from in a host of areas. Increasing the income tax rate from 5.25% to 6.25%, increasing it by 1%, will raise about $2.5 billion. Lowering the sales tax from 6.25% to 4.5%, which he will then designate for transportation needs, would result in a loss of about $1.4 billion. He then wants to increase taxes on tobacco and non-tobacco products, which will raise about $166 million. So with those tax rate changes, there'd be about $1.27 billion in net new revenue. Then he changes some deductions and exemptions. He doubles the personal exemption. So what happens, there's a decrease of about $1.1 billion in revenue as a result of that occurring. Elimination of targeted tax deductions, about $1.26 billion will be generated by that. Some of the deductions that people rely on in various contexts will be gone, and so $1.26 billion will be on the plus side. And then presently, candy and soda are exempt from the sales tax. The governor, for the second year, at least the second year in a row, is proposing that that exemption end and that candy and soda be subject to the sales tax. That will raise about $53 million. So the net revenue on the deduction side is about $213 million. And then the next one is business taxes. The governor will extend sales tax to computer services. And what he's proposing there is if somebody modifies a program or upgrades computers, presently they are exempt in a business context. They would no longer be exempt, or at least not to the extent they are now. And the governor hopes that that would generate about $259 million in additional revenue. Eliminating various other deductions such as excise sales factor, reclassification of certain businesses, and capping the film tax credit. He figures will save about $30 million. That one gains a lot of attention because it's something that hits the newspapers because the filming that they do in Boston, and there are 2 films right now that are being shot in Boston, they're here, and a lot of times because of this tax cut that they receive, this tax credit that they receive. And there's an expectation that if that is cut, as recently as today, a group came out and said basically that the loss of revenue, they feel, would be about $174.6 million if that tax credit disappears. So really you're looking at a tax credit that, because it's eliminated, will result in about $30 million more, but those who support the film tax credit think that you're doing so at the expense of about $174.6 million in additional spending and the taxes that are generated as a result of that additional spending. Those are numbers that are constantly challenged, and I don't know for certain what the real number is, but I just highlight that because it gives you some sense of what goes into determining what's behind these numbers. So when you look at those various credits, there's about $483 million in additional net revenue. And there are a couple others that should be pointed out, tax exemptions that a lot of people rely on when they do their personal income tax. For instance, the personal home capital gains tax, which is $250,000 presently for an individual, $500,000 for somebody filing jointly. You have an exemption in your capital gains up to that amount. That would be eliminated. The lead paint abatement exemption, which is relied upon by landlords to abate their units so that they can then rent them to families with children, that lead paint abatement exemption would be eliminated. The college tuition exemption, which is near and dear to my heart these days, would be eliminated. There are work-related exemptions, for instance, T-passes and things of that nature. Those exemptions would be eliminated, and a Social Security payments exemption up to $2,000 would be eliminated. And that's the one that most people see when they get their W-2, and it shows a state figure and a federal figure, and sometimes they have difficulty reconciling why they're different. It's because of the way Social Security is reported. And that exemption would disappear at the state level. So the governor proposes an increase in revenue, all told, increases, decreases, resulting in a net increase of somewhere about $2.1 billion. And quite frankly, it's difficult to get a real firm number on that because there are a lot of different reports out there as far as what his different proposals do. But about $2.1 billion is the number that we've put together based on the information that we have. The last couple slides, just very quickly, one of the things that the governor does in his proposal is he increases Chapter 70 money to towns. And this is pretty interesting. Chapter 70 money is money that's used for education in the communities. And if you look at the slide that's up there, I have 3 towns on there, Abington, Holbrook, and Rockland. And the governor prepared these maps, and he gave them to all members of the legislature so that they would know what the impact of his plan is in their district. And when you look at this, for instance, Holbrook, the governor's numbers show that Holbrook would receive an extra $562,990 as a result of the changes in Chapter 70. It shows that Rockland would receive about $434,675 as a result of the increased funding in Chapter 70. And it shows that Abington would receive $50,425 as a result of the changes in Chapter 70. So that's an interesting dynamic because a lot of this revenue, as we talked about in the earlier slides, comes from an increase in the state income tax. So you might have somebody that lives in Abington and you might have somebody who lives in Rockland, and say both of them make $50,000, whatever a figure may be, that will result in them paying more on their income tax. Where you're going to say under the governor's proposal that somebody who makes X amount of dollars in Abington is going to pay that, and yet the town of Abington as a whole will only get about $50,000 benefit from that under Chapter 70 funding. And over in Rockland, somebody making the same amount of money, paying the same increase rate in their income tax, well, the town of Rockland in the aggregate will see about $434,000. So those are the types of things that we wrestle with at the legislature, we try to come up with formulas that strike the appropriate balance. And with the governor's plan as it is presently, it continues the pattern of some towns doing better than other towns relative to Chapter 70 funding. It's something that is systemic at this point, but I think has to be looked at so that there's a more equitable payout to the communities when it comes to this type of funding. The next slide shows you what the numbers are in Quincy. Quincy would see about $2.7 million increase in Chapter 70, and Braintree would see about $1 million increase in Chapter 70. And the next two slides are really not budget items, but because the governor presented them and because it's part of his presentation, I thought I would show them. These are the governor's proposals relative to Chapter 90, which is basically funding for road work in the local communities. And you can see that there's a 10-year increase shown on there. The governor's proposing to basically bond Chapter 90 out for a period of 10 years, which would then obligate the Commonwealth out as far as perhaps as 2053. And I'm still trying to get a handle on those numbers, but it looks like it's going to be a bond that will provide funding for 10 years and then have a life payback of about 30 years beyond that, and that's how you get out to the 2053 year. So we're going to be tying up a lot of money under this Chapter 90 proposal and under our bond cap. But you can see that the 10-year increase for the city of Quincy would be about $9.6 million, and Braintree would be about $4.9 million, Abington about 1.9, Holbrook about 1.1, and Rockland at about 1.9. And those slides, which we have here, also show you the various projects that are involved or targeted for Chapter 90 funding. Presently, the way we do Chapter 90 is that each year the governor will come in with a proposal for Chapter 90. He'll release the information to the local towns. He'll send the authorization to the legislature. The legislature will consider it, and you would hope vote on it pretty quickly, but what's happened the last couple of years has been a delay in the vote on Chapter 90 because it's been tied in with some other bonds. And there's some members of the legislature that think it should be just a straight vote on Chapter 90 and nothing else. Others believe that it's appropriate to have it be part of a bigger bond, and that kind of discord has resulted, particularly last year, in there being extended time before it was passed. So that's really the presentation that I have. And the last page really just kind of outlines the process, the budget process here. As I mentioned earlier, the governor files his budget. He filed it January 23rd. It's called House 1. It is not binding on the legislature, either the Senate or the House. What it is, in most basic terms, it is the governor's expression of where he would like to see the Commonwealth's money spent. Once that budget's received, and as it's received, the House Ways and Means Committee is meeting regularly, and they are preparing their own budget. They file their budget typically in mid-April. Representative Nyman, who serves on the Ways and Means Committee, indicated that it might be April 10th, I think is what she said earlier this evening. So April 10th, the House Ways and Means budget will be released. And the House will debate that budget. They will pass that budget. It will then be put aside. The Senate Ways and Means Committee is meeting now. They will prepare a budget. They will file their budget. We will file on the Senate side a budget in mid-May. That Senate budget will be passed by the end of May. Then the Senate budget and the House budgets are compared, and where there are any differences, they are argued out, they are resolved in what they call a conference committee. And then a budget is presented to the House and the Senate. That is a budget of agreement, basically. And that budget is presented in June. It's acted upon. It goes to the governor late June. The governor takes action on it, passes with vetoes, whatever the case may be, and then it's sent back to the legislature for any override votes as necessary. So that's the budget process. We have a ways to go. And the reason that I'm here this evening is to make people aware of what the governor's proposal is, because it is a significant proposal. And just to put in some context, this is the start of my second term in the legislature. We do 2-year sessions. So I've gone through the budget process twice. In both cases, individuals came into the office and basically presented a case for level funding, not even a level services budget. A level services budget is the cost that is necessary to maintain existing services. There's then a level funded budget, which is typically less. So people would come in from the various groups and advocacy groups representing pretty much every line in the budget, and they were asking for level funding, not even level service funding, but just level funding. This year, the governor came out with his proposal, and everybody who's come into the office has been requesting an increase in their budget. So the debate, the dynamic has changed completely. And the governor has certainly spurred discussion and debate, and we'll continue with this process, and we'll see where it ends up. I'm all ears at this point. I will tell you that I am, at the outset, opposed to the governor's budget proposal for a couple of reasons. First off, and I think the most significant reason for me, is that the governor is asking for about $2 billion in additional tax revenue, asking for the taxpayers of the Commonwealth to pay about $2 billion more, and he has submitted a budget that calls for about $3 billion more in spending. So he's asking for $2 billion, which is a lot to ask, and then he comes in with a budget that shows an increase of about $3 billion in spending. He pays for that extra $3 billion by drawing from the rainy day account and by relying on revenue anticipation notes, basically relying on revenue from fiscal years down the road. He's basically paying for today with the expectation that we'll be able to get additional revenue down the road. The last time the Commonwealth did that, they got in a little bit of trouble. So first and foremost, I'm opposed to the governor's proposal because it creates a structural imbalance, a structural deficit of about $1 billion. And when you have such a large structural deficit while asking for $2 billion in new tax revenue, I just don't think it's realistic. And there are some other components of the governor's plan that I disagree with. I recognize that we have to invest in infrastructure. I recognize that we have to invest in education, in human services accounts, all of those things. And I probably say it 10 times a day. What we're charged with, I think, is finding the proper balance between an appropriate level of taxation and an appropriate level of services provided. I don't think the governor's proposal strikes that balance. So that's where things are at, and that's where I'm at relative to the governor's proposal, but I'm here to take any questions that people have or to have any discussion that people may wish to have relative to the governor's proposal or anything else for that matter. So I guess if anybody has any questions. Yes?
When the those charts you were showing about the tax rates over the last 10 years, so why was it just income tax? Why we've had increases, state sales tax went up 25%, meals tax went up. I think the cigarette tax went up somewhere in there. How come that's not counted in it?
Well, it's
more revenue.
well, one of the slides did show the combination of basically the tax burden. The other thing that has occurred is you've seen an increase in fees. Not so much in the last couple of years. This past fiscal year, there were very few increases, if any, in fees. But a few years ago, there was rather dramatic increases in fees. And fees, some people say, is just another name for taxes. That has occurred, and even with that increase, for instance, in the sales tax, even with the increase in fees, given what happened in 2008, meaning the economy fell apart, and given what happened on the state income tax, on the personal exemption doubling, and on the dividend tax decrease, you're still left with about $3 billion less than what was there. And I don't have an opinion, honestly, as to whether that was right or wrong. Well, I think it's misleading. I disagree. I think I know what you're saying. Honestly, to be able to put a chart together to show what the increase in fees, for instance, has been, it would take us a long time to get all that information because the fees have been scattered across all the departments.
There's very info also that shows I know we must have lost some population because we lost one of our congressmen and everything. Is that affecting that at all?
We didn't lose population. We just gained less population than some other states. We did not lose population here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Our population has increased. I don't have the exact number. But other states did lose population. Other states grew faster than Massachusetts. Proportionally, Massachusetts did not grow as fast as some of the other states, and that's what resulted in the change in the congressional districts and the loss of a congressional seat. So our population has increased.
Now, those numbers that were showing that the unemployment rate, I think, showing 6.7% to 6.5 last month or something?
Yes, it was a 6.7% in January, and the number that I looked at literally right before I left the office tonight was it's at 6.5%.
No, your numbers of people working, what would that translate to? Like how many more people would be working? 1,000?
No, it's pretty substantial. I didn't bring that with me, but I can get that number for you if you want to just give us your name. Yeah, what it is, a net increase in jobs, I don't know. I also looked at, before I left, where some of the jobs are increasing, what segments of the economy, and some of them, for instance, the service hospitality industry has seen an increase. The trades are finally starting to see a pickup. They're not back anywhere near where they were.
The reason why I wonder is, say if it's 1,000 people that are no longer collecting unemployment or welfare, and instead they're contributing tax money, then 1,000 people might be saving $600 a week. That's pretty substantial.
Yeah, there's some math involved in there because there's unemployment being paid. A lot of those people may have dropped onto mass health, for instance, so there's an additional health care cost. So those costs have increased as people become unemployed. As they fall off the unemployment rolls and gain employment, there is a lag between falling off the roll and getting caught, our numbers catching up with them. There is a lag in that. And also what they're finding is, while that is occurring, people are still hesitant to spend money like they were. So even though sales numbers are respectable, they're not quite where they were. So while you see people coming off unemployment, coming off of mass health, getting employed, having withholding taxes, the state's realizing that, you're still seeing that spending isn't quite where it used to be. And so the numbers haven't really come back to where they were in fiscal year 2008. The stock market, for instance, has done very well. It's rebounded to the levels that it was back in fiscal year 2008. But unfortunately, a lot of people withdrew their money from the stock market and so haven't realized the gains. Or if they have the gains, they haven't realized them because they haven't sold stock, for instance. So there's a lot of things that come into the mix. Yes?
I was curious when on the tax reductions, the reduction on dividend income reduced from 12 to 5.3%. That seems like a pretty dramatic drop.
It is a pretty dramatic drop.
I mean, you've got people that make their living and make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on just dividends and investments.
Right.
And as our past governor.
Right.
So I'm curious why the governor put that.
Well, that's one that has occurred in the past. You're referring to the reduction from 12 to 5.3. That's a reduction that occurred, and I don't know the answer for that, and I don't know the exact date that cut took place or whether it was phased in. But the other thing that has occurred is, since 2008, the value of stocks has plummeted. So any dividends being paid on stocks has been minimal. So even with that decrease, there's kind of an offset there, because if the market was doing well, you could have gone from 12% to 5%. If the market continued to climb, your dividend income might not have dropped all that dramatically. But with the drop in the market and the drop in the dividend rate, it was a pretty substantial loss in income, and we show that number in there. Anybody else?
The fact that the governor wants to increase the income tax and wants to decrease the sales tax is putting like a double burden on the income tax people who are doing 50% of the work and earning the money. I think it was good having the sales tax because everybody had to pay it. But now when you lower that, you put an additional burden on those who are working.
Yeah, there's a lot of dynamics at play here. Some feel that lowering the sales tax actually benefits those who are less affluent, because say somebody makes $50,000, they've got to go out and they've got to purchase the basics. They've got to purchase food, they've got to purchase clothing, the things that they need. That ends up being a bigger proportion of their income than if they were very wealthy. So by decreasing the sales tax, the governor's theory is anyway that you decrease the sales tax, you're lessening the burden on those who fall in the mid or lower income levels because they pay a larger proportion of their income in sales tax. So that's his rationale, and his rationale for raising the income tax, the way he has done it, is that he feels that those who are at the upper income levels will pay more than those at the lower income levels when you put all of this together. That remains to be seen. I haven't seen a lot of the details, but it remains to be seen. But some people like that dynamic, lower the sales and increase the income tax for that reason. And he then has designated the sales tax money for infrastructure improvements. But, again, I don't think it strikes the balance when you're talking about $2 billion in new revenue and spending of $3 billion. Yes?
I would agree with you that I'm not totally sold on the total dollar figure in the package. I would support shifting the tax burden more towards the income tax away from the sales tax for the reason that you stated. In fact, I'd support even bigger reduction in the sales tax. I think we would make us more competitive among other states, maybe draw back some of the business that we currently do in New Hampshire if the sales tax was more of 2 or 3% versus 4 or 5 or 6%. But I would also want to see more of this money, I think, earmarked for internal auditing programs, internal fraud detection programs. I think it's important to make sure that I don't have a problem paying for these programs, but I want to make sure that these programs are being spent appropriately. And I know one of the issues that we've read about with some of the problems in some of these agencies is that they don't have the staff right now to make sure that their rules are being followed. And I really would like to make sure that these additional funds would be spent properly. I would also encourage the legislature to consider linking more of the sales tax in particular to specific infrastructure projects, like we do currently with the school building, like we do currently with the MBTA. That way, there's less opportunity for that money to then, in later years, to be spent elsewhere that it wasn't initially intended to. So that if it's built right into the bond issuing that this money has to be spent on these projects, I think it makes it a lot easier to sell what this additional money will be spent for. And finally, I would support the removing the exemption for candy and soda, not to raise revenue, but just the fact that I don't consider them essentials, and I don't think they should be taxed as they are, that I would want them to be treated as any optional item that we purchase.
Great. I'll take a few of those things. The idea of auditing and having employees in place to properly monitor the state's spending to make sure that there's not fraud or abuse out there is a very good point. I think, for instance, right now we are paying for some of the cutbacks that we've had in some of our departments. Take the Hinton Laboratory scandal. We cut that budget. I mean, the legislature did over 4, 5, 6 years since 2008. That budget's been cut pretty significantly, and we're now paying millions and millions of dollars because there wasn't appropriate oversight at that facility. And I'm not necessarily saying that more money would have resulted in more oversight, but there is that nexus. If we had people there in the appropriate positions monitoring, better auditing what was going on, then what happened there could have been detected. And we wouldn't have had to spend an additional $30 million like we just approved about 3 weeks ago for that situation. Same thing when we talk about the compounding lab out in Framingham. The Department of Public Health is responsible for the oversight of pharmacies. They will tell you, and the numbers bear it out as well, that they've had cutbacks in personnel and in overall funding, and that they are burdened with a great many obligations. They, as a result, weren't able to do some of the inspections that they probably should have been doing. And we had an owner of a facility out there that, in my opinion, was doing things that he shouldn't, or they shouldn't have been doing. People died as a result of it. The state went out and inspected all the other compounding facilities, and 4 out of, and I don't remember the number, but it's a pretty significant number of facilities were deemed not to meet standards. And it was difficult, given the budgetary constraints, for the state to do that other than that emergency situation. So it is important that we properly fund these budgets, particularly so that we can make sure that we have auditing processes in place and oversight in place. A lot has been said about the EBT situation, and that is a function of oversight and auditing. I think we've got to take a very good look at that. One of the things I think we have to do is eliminate the ability of people to be able to access cash through the EBT program. It's a very valuable program, and for the most part, people use it and they use it responsibly, but there are abuses. And while the governor may say that the abuses in the grand scheme don't amount to a lot of money, anytime you get into $1 million or more, $500,000, $250,000 of taxpayers' money, it is significant. And it also is significant because the perception it gives that the state is not able to look out for its money. So I think we do need better oversight there. I think we should look at taking away the ability to get cash. And I think that we should come up with a better program. I know, for instance, college students at many of the universities in Boston, they have these cards where they can go to different stores and restaurants and fast food places and use the cards. The Suffolk University, I think, calls it the RAM card. And you can go into a deli, and it'll have a sign that says, we accept the RAM card here. So the technology is there that if the person goes in, they use their RAM card, and it's deducted from their student account. And you know, so that technology is there. It gets a little bit complicated, and this is where some of the pushback comes from in some of the more urban areas where there may not be a big supermarket. There may not be a Shaw's, a Hannaford's, a Stop and Shop, or whatever the case may be, and they're local convenience stores that are on corners, and that they can't afford the technology. So it's very difficult then to put it in place and to require that a person goes to a supermarket where the technology is there. They may not have access to it. So, but I do think there is technology there. I think we've got to look at that. I think it's worth spending the money on prevention rather than detection. As far as the sales tax being linked, that has worked very well with the School Building Authority. Abington has just had a project funded with the School Building Authority. Rockland has a high school, middle school project that's presently ongoing. A portion of the funds are designated for School Building Authority. It seems to work pretty well. As far as and I think it also conveys to people that if you're going to give more money in taxes, you should be able to see where it's going to go. Not that every tax dollar should be spent that way, because you do need what they call a general fund to cover general government expenditures. But for specific programs, I think people like the idea that if they pay a dollar, they know it's going to a specific program, and then they can see something tangible come of that tax dollar. As far as the exemption for candy and soda, when the sales tax was put in place, essentials were exempt. Clothing was considered one of those. Food was considered one of those at supermarkets and so forth. And for whatever reason, candy and soda has fallen into that category. And I tend to agree that I don't think it's an essential anymore. And there's also the public health component to this. And I know everybody hates the idea of Big Brother telling us what to eat and drink and where to go and so forth. But you know, just every single study has shown that the amount of soda and candy that's consumed is exorbitant. Although just recently, for the first time in this country, well, I'm not sorry, not for the first time, but for the first time in a while, water has become the preferred beverage of choice. It has surpassed soda for the first time in many, many years. So people are getting back more to water. They're drinking bottled water, which is a whole other issue. But I do think removing the exemption for candy and soda is something that we should look at. Anything else?
Ask some about the transportation issues. Just how can the governor be talking about expanding things as much as he is now, with a number that's probably going to be raised once they start building it, when they can't maintain or manage what they have now?
I absolutely positively agree. The governor wants to spend anywhere from $1.6 to $1.8 billion, for instance, on the South Coast Rail that will bring commuter rail from Boston down to Fall River and New Bedford. Conceptually, might be a good idea. At this stage, when commuter rail here in Abington is not provided on weekends, at the time when Red Line services is not always what it should be, particularly in this region, when people don't have the access that they used to have to the ride, when they're talking about cutting back on ferries that were promised to developers and to homeowners in certain areas, to go and spend $1.6, $1.8 billion on a rail to South Coast, to me, just doesn't make any sense. The governor, in his State of the State address, said, wouldn't it be great if somebody who works in the seaport could get on the commuter rail and go home to New Bedford and Fall River? And I just think that that's wrong in so many ways. It's an hour and 20 minutes, perhaps, commute. I think people's time is better spent on employment close to home, where they then have the opportunity for overtime rather than sitting on a train. They have the opportunity to spend more time with their family rather than sitting on a train. And as far as spurring economic development, for instance, in the region of New Bedford and Fall River, I would rather see surface transportation improved in that area, and that the state then look to spur economic growth down there for that workforce, rather than have that workforce travel all the way to Boston. I do think the Green Line expansion is one that will probably generate more economic benefit than its cost. maybe not in the short term, but I think in the near to short, long term, if that's a good phrase, I think that would work. But I do think we've got to get what we're doing, and we've got to do it better. There's still the issue on commuter rail going into Boston. On many of the branches, people will comment pretty regularly that they're not collecting fares, that you can get on a train and ride from wherever. Maybe we shouldn't say this publicly because people do it, but you can ride from wherever into Boston and nobody comes and collects a fare. And you know, you can go to one of the subway lines, and if the place where you get your Charlie card isn't working, you're waved through. And how much that adds up to, I don't know. The MBTA says, oh no, we're doing it, and yet we hear pretty regularly that it's not occurring. So we've got to do things better with what we have before we talk about a rail line to New Bedford Fall River, before we talk about a rail line from Pittsfield to New York City, before we talk about any of those big projects. My concern on the one to South Coast is that the state is spending money to improve bridges, to do environmental studies, and I think what you're going to find over the course of 3 or 4 years is the argument that we've gone so far we can't turn back. So as we look at all these bonding proposals, it is a good time to get a real look at where the governor is on that, and if he's going to continue to spend, to try to put the brakes on it.
In addition to people who are getting by when they're not collecting the fares, it also seems, I don't know if it's a written rule or non-written rule, but there's certain people that don't have to pay. Maybe they're MBTA retirees, their spouses. I've seen people flash what looks like a sheriff's card ID from the sheriff's office. And I guess that might have made sense back 50 years ago when a token was a dime. But if you're taking the commuter rail down to Plymouth, that could be a $3,000 or $4,000 a year for that now.
Sure. And you have a person doing that, and for the person who goes out and buys their Charlie card or buys their monthly T-Pass to get to and from work, the governor's proposal takes away that exemption or that credit on their taxes. So the good person, the person who's doing everything right, is being penalized twice over because the MBTA is not doing what they should do on fare collection. Now, they claim they are, but we keep hearing that they are not. And it's frustrating. And again, I don't know what it adds up to, but it gets pretty frustrating.
One other question I had about the cutbacks they did some on the commuter rail. Like we got double whammy from the Kingston line where they raised rates almost 30% and they cut service 30%. Now I can remember when they signed the contract with the MBCR organization, it was like a fixed contract for a number of years that was going to provide service 7 days a week. Now, did they rewrite this contract, or are we still paying them not to do weekend service?
There have been adjustments, and I'm not positive on this, and I will check into it further, but I think that contract was just recently put out to bid, but I'm not positive on that. But we can get you that information.
Because I didn't read anything about the contract being redone.
No, there's a lot of issues. The MBTA last year, we had to do a supplemental appropriation. I think it was $51 million. And this year, the projected deficit is about $161 million. And they're starting to talk now about fare increases and reductions in service again. The legislature will take that up relatively soon. Most, if not all, public transportation systems in the world operate at a deficit. As I keep saying, it's the balance. It's finding what's the appropriate balance for taxpayer funding of public transportation and what's the appropriate amount for somebody to pay. Politically, the issue that comes up in trying to fund the MBTA is that the MBTA has a defined area of service, which, let's call it, say, within 128, just to keep it easy, although it extends out a little further in some cases. Politically, it's very difficult to get somebody from Western Massachusetts or wherever the case may be to vote to do something with the MBTA because they don't get any benefit for it. A lot of those communities are served with regional transit authorities, and their argument is that the regional transit authorities haven't been properly funded. And what's unfortunate is the regional transit authorities are now budgeted the way the MBTA used to be, which is basically provide the service and then give the bill to the region. The MBTA used to provide the service and give the bill to the state, and the state would have to pay it. The state at one point switched and put it on a regular budgeting process. Here's what you have to spend, live with it. They didn't do all the calculations correctly. They didn't anticipate, for instance, an increase in health insurance costs for its employees. But we're looking at forward funding the regional transit authorities, which would require a double up If the operation costs $200 million this year, and we just got the bill, we have to pay that, and then to pay for the next year going forward, we have to pay another $200 million. So it's a doubling up, but it makes good economic sense. The other thing we have to look at the MBTA is presently we pay an exorbitant number of employees with bonded money. So for every dollar that we pay in wages, we may be paying $1.51 over the course of that bond. And it just makes no fiscal sense. To move the Regional Transit Authority into forward funding, the regional transit authorities, and to take our employees off the bonded rolls and put them in a regular, make them, pay them out of the state's general fund, that alone may cost anywhere from between $400 and $600 million. So even if revenues go up $400 to $600 million, John Q. Public may not see any difference in the quality of service that they receive. But it would be a sound fiscal move to do it with longer-term benefits. For instance, its impact on our bonding rating would be very favorable. But those are the types of things that we're going to have to look at over the course of the next couple of months.
And talking about the commuter rail, I think one problem residents in this district have is that their monthly commuter rail pass is now over, I think, $200. And it's becoming cost prohibitive for people from Abington to take a commuter rail in and out of work. It's significantly cheaper to drive to Quincy, where you can get a red line pass for $70 and the cost of parking is exactly the same. So there's no impetus for people from Abington to stay in Abington and just hop on the commuter rail. So that just requires an additional subsidy to run the commuter rail operations down this way.
Right.
And I would encourage the MBTA to start to consider how much that's being paid, or look into those calculations to find out what's working.
Yeah, they've got to find the right formula. And the other formula, which I know has been talked about, is the parking formula. I drove through the Abington commuter rail station last week. It was going over to the senior center. And it was after snowstorm, so a lot of the spaces were taken by snowbanks, but nonetheless, the lot still wasn't full. So you do see decreased ridership because of the cost of the pass, because of parking cost. Somebody makes the informed decision. It's cheaper to drive. Maybe a little bit more aggravation with traffic, but it's cheaper to drive. So I'm going to drive. They contribute to backups. They contribute to pollution. All those types of things. So it's finding that right balance. The other thing that the MBTA has looked at, some people have urged them to look at it a little more, is advertising at commuter rail stations, at bus stops, things of that nature. Some studies have shown that the MBTA is only scratching the surface with what they could take in advertising revenue. Is it enough to make up a deficit of $161 million? It's not, but it's something that they should be looking at. And there's a general sense that they're just not looking hard enough at some of these things. And it's our hope that the conversations over the course of the next few months and even into the fall, if necessary, will spur them on to taking a better look at these things.
The information on it's great to hear the unemployment rate goes down in the state, but what are the jobs paying? If they're service industry jobs, are they all paying $10 an hour, 30 hours a week, no health care benefits, which has another impact on the state?
We can get those numbers for you. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has those numbers, and they break it down by segment, whether it's construction, service, a whole host of different breakdowns. We can get those numbers for you. They won't be as current as the unemployment figure, but they would most likely be current, I think the last time I looked at them, through middle of January, I believe. So those numbers are available. The concern is that some of the jobs being created are not paying what people were used to making, that people are underemployed. There is a measurement of underemployment out there. It's not scientific to any great extent, but there is a measure out there. So there is some underemployment. There is some belief that the number of people out there who have just fallen off the unemployment rolls without getting a job, they've just given up. Maybe they're 62 or 63, they were hoping to work for another 4 or 5 years, have been laid off for a year and a half, and they just say, you know what, I guess I'll just retire and maybe work part-time or whatever. You do see an uptick in the trades, which is good. It's great to see the cranes in downtown Boston. You're starting to see them out and about in some of the areas around Boston and some of the metro areas.
Housing, the building is expensive. It's all luxury housing. You don't see any. I don't know how people can afford some of those apartments or the condos that they're building in the city down in the Seaport District. Everything's
very expensive. There's been a little bit of a shift in the Seaport District, for instance, because of the cost of the land. They're going into these micro units that are anywhere from 300, 350 square feet to about 450, 500 square feet, pretty small, you don't get a lot of space for your money. You get a fair amount of amenities, but they're still expensive. So the idea is, which I think is, spur some economic development in places like New Bedford and Fall River, provide the transportation in. There's still some land outside of those types of areas where housing would be somewhat affordable. And I think we do have to keep working on the supply housing. For every high-end unit that you build, hopefully that's not somebody moving in from out of state with a lot of money. Hopefully it's somebody moving up in housing. Okay, my job's going pretty well. I'll move up to the next level of housing. Maybe it won't be a house, but maybe it'll be a condo in an urban area, whatever the case may be, which then frees up that middle level home, which then somebody hopefully will move into that frees up the lower. The problem is we don't have enough. The governor set a target of 10,000 housing units, and we haven't come near approaching that. One, because of permitting issues. Two, because of the cost of the land. And three, the economy just isn't quite where it has to be for that type of acceleration relative to the housing market. It's getting there. As we talked about in one of the slides earlier, there's an expectation of reasonable growth in the housing market, but not enough to have it filter down so that there's affordable housing available. Some municipalities are doing some pretty good things. In the city of Quincy, we have a substantial downtown Quincy project that's going, and there's a set aside in that for affordable housing, and if the developer doesn't want to build the affordable housing, they put money into an affordable housing trust, which is then leveraged for the construction of affordable housing. The developer just had the period of time extended, the period within which he had to make the payment, but there will be a sizable payment, for instance, on the first project into a affordable housing trust. And again, that money is then leveraged. But we have a long way to go. It's just very expensive. And then as we move out, land's more affordable, but transportation to the work areas becomes prohibitive. So we're right in a catch-22 right now. I think the answer is development around transit hubs. There was just a study that came out that showed that the value of housing in transportation shed areas, meaning areas where you have walking access to a high-speed transit. So it would be, for instance, where I live in the city of Quincy, within a half mile, 3/4 of a mile to a red line station. Housing generally in those areas did about 129% better than housing that is outside of that transportation shed area. So Abington, somebody who's near the commuter rail station, their property values might have done a little better, but not as well as the property values of somebody who's near a rapid transit where there's predictable, frequent transportation to a work area. So that's where the answer is.
Is there anything new on the base as far as what the governor is trying to get as far as companies going into the base to bring jobs into the base?
Down Southfield?
Yes.
Yes, that effort continues. They have shifted to Southfield, again, to housing because they think that's what's hot right now. They think that's where their best opportunity is to get some of the seed money they need to then continue on with their program. There's still some issues at the base about some cleanup that has to be done. We worked with Representative Nyman from Rockland to, with one of the state agencies to free up some funding to get the access road to Rockland into the base done. There was some issues with drainage and all of that. That worked out. There had been a transition in the way the state government funded some of these programs, and that project got stuck in the middle of it. But we were able to free up the money to allow for the construction of that. So it's ongoing. Is there any expectation that you're going to see larger scale, retail, commercial, anytime in the near future? I don't know. I'm sorry?
Biotech would be better, better paying jobs?
Biotech, a lot of those, life sciences, you name it, a lot of those things. We will be meeting with Kevin Donovan, who's the director over there, sometime within the next week or week and a half to get an update on exactly where things are there and to provide any help that we can. Okay. Well, thank you very much for attending. I thank you for people who are watching at home. If anybody has any questions, I'll give you my office telephone number. It's 617-722-1494, and email is john.keenan@masenate.gov. The best way to get in contact with us is to call. You'll get a live person. We have Molly Sullivan here, who is a person who's on the phone. Kristen Grazioso from the office, who handles local affairs. Alejandro Alves, who works on policy and our committee work. And Rich Bilecki, who does our budget work. is here. So we're busy, but a phone call is the best way to get us because we're in the office, and we'll make sure you get a return call. So again, please feel free to contact us. If you have any requests for information in addition to what we've provided, or as the budget process unfolds, please let us know. It's very, very important that we are contacted, that you express your opinions to us. That really does have an impact, and it's very valuable as we go through the budget process. So thank you. I'd also like to thank Abington Cable for broadcasting this evening, recording it. Thank you, Mr. Bob Toomey.